They say no act of kindness is ever truly forgotten, but for most people, especially those who have the least to give, it's easier to believe no one's paying attention. She didn't know anyone was watching. She just did what felt right, even if it cost her everything. It was early morning. The rain fell hard, drenching the streets and battering the windows of a small, quiet diner. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee clung to the air. The place was nearly empty. A tired waitress, Grace, wiped down tables with slow, practiced motions. Her eyes were heavy, her steps dragging, but she still managed a small smile for the silence around her. Then the bell above the door rang. She looked up. A young boy stood in the doorway, soaked from head to toe. His hoodie clung to his frame and water pooled at his feet. He was shivering, alone, maybe 11, maybe 12. No parent, no backpack, no explanation. Grace paused, her hand tightening around the rag. She saw the fear in his eyes, the kind that comes from being ignored one too many times. "Sweetheart, you all right?" she asked gently. The boy didn't respond. His eyes darted to the corner booth and then back to the floor. There's need to answer. Hunger doesn't need words. Grace led him to the booth. He followed without protest, dripping the whole way. She disappeared briefly and came back with a towel, draping it over his shoulders with care. He flinched at first, then slowly relaxed. "You'll warm up, okay?" she said. "I'll get you something hot." He didn't speak, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. Maybe even trust. She moved into the kitchen. A pot of soup simmered on the stove. She ladled it carefully into a bowl and placed it on a plate with a grilled cheese. Just before heading back out, she added 2 extra pickle slices. She hesitated, then tossed in a chocolate chip cookie, too. She set the plate in front of him with a soft smile. "Eat while it's hot, and if anyone asks, you're my nephew. Got it?" For the first time, he almost smiled. Just barely. Then he ate quickly, gratefully, like it was the first real meal he'd had in days. Because maybe it was... Grace didn't ask where he came from. She didn't ask why he was alone. She just watched from across the diner as he devoured every bite. Time passed. The storm outside didn't let up. Grace kept the coffee going, checked on him quietly, and made sure he stayed dry. She didn't hover. She just made sure he had everything he needed and nothing to fear. She even packed a brown paper bag and placed it on the table without saying a word. Inside, a sandwich, a granola bar, and an apple. "For later," she said casually. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. The way he clutched the bag said enough. Before he left, she scribbled something on the bill slip and slid it toward him. He flipped it over and read the message, a doodle of a sun peeking through clouds, and underneath, in scratchy handwriting, "You matter. Don't forget that." He looked up, but Grace was already across the diner, cleaning another table like nothing had happened. He stood, pulled his hood over his head, and walked back out into the rain. Grace watched him from the window, her reflection blurred against the glass. Her eyes lingered on the spot where he vanished down the street. She thought no one noticed, but one day, someone very important did. She stood at the window a while longer, the rain drawing streaks across the glass like tears. In the booth behind her, the used dishes still sat untouched by cleanup. She didn't rush. Let them sit. Let the memory breathe. Grace had seen plenty of hard cases in her time. Angry drunks, desperate runaways, mothers hiding bruises. But there was something different about that boy. Something quiet. Something haunted. He hadn't begged, hadn't even asked. And maybe that's what broke her heart the most. She finally turned away, cleared the table, and slipped the untouched cookie into her apron pocket. The towel he'd left behind was damp and cold. She held it a moment longer than she needed to, then dropped it into the laundry bin. Behind the counter, the morning cook, Carlos, raised an eyebrow. "You giving out charity again, Grace?" She didn't answer, just poured herself a half cup of lukewarm coffee and took a sip. Carlos shook his head. "One day Vic's gonna catch you, and when he does..." "I know," she said quietly. "Kid yours or something?" He waited. She didn't offer anything else. Carlos sighed and went back to prepping eggs. You got a soft spot, Grace. Big one. Someone's got to. The bell above the door jingled again, and a couple in construction vests came in laughing about the weather. Grace straightened her apron, pushed the memory of the boy down, and got back to work, smiling, pouring coffee, taking orders like nothing ever happened. But that moment stayed with her. For the rest of the shift, she kept glancing at the corner booth, as if somehow, maybe, he'd still be sitting there. Maybe the rain would bring him back, but it didn't. That night, as she rode the bus home, the city smeared past her in streaks of wet neon. She leaned her forehead against the cold glass, eyes heavy. Her stop came, and she stepped out into the night, coat pulled tight. 3 blocks from her apartment, she passed an alley. She hesitated. The shadows stirred. A rat darted past. Somewhere deeper in, someone coughed. She opened her bag, pulled out a wrapped sandwich from the diner, and set it down just inside the alley entrance. No words, just a silent offering. And then she walked away. Inside her apartment, her father coughed from the bedroom. The oxygen machine clicked and hissed. She checked on him, adjusted his blanket, kissed his forehead. Long day, he rasped. Same as always, she whispered. He smiled faintly. You're a good girl, Gracie. Your mama would have been proud. She didn't respond, just sat there for a while, listening to his breathing until it slowed and evened out again. Later that night, she took the cookie out of her apron pocket. She stared at it for a long moment, then placed it gently in a glass jar on the kitchen shelf, alongside a few other small items she couldn't bring herself to throw away. A handmade thank you note from a homeless man, a drawing from a girl whose mother never came back, a broken toy car left behind on a booth seat. Small things, forgotten things. But to Grace, they were reminders of why she kept showing up, of who she was trying to be in a world that kept asking her to look the other way. And somewhere out there, a boy was walking the rainy streets with a brown paper bag, full stomach, and the memory of a stranger's kindness. She didn't know his name, didn't know if she'd ever see him again, but she prayed for him anyway. The same way she prayed for every person who passed through that door and didn't know how to ask for help. She didn't think anyone was watching. She didn't think it mattered. But she was wrong. Because years later, when the world had moved on, when time had washed that rainy day into memory, someone very important would remember. And everything would change. Every morning before the sun even thought about rising, Grace slipped out the door of her cramped apartment, careful not to wake her father. The old man slept with a raspy wheeze, his breath tethered to the oxygen machine that hummed beside his bed. She always paused at the doorway, just for a second, to make sure he was still breathing. Then she'd pull on her coat, still damp from yesterday's rain, and step into the cold. Her days started before the world had its first cup of coffee. By the time the first customers shuffled into the diner, her back already ached and her feet throbbed in cheap shoes. Still, she smiled. Always smiled. Because Grace had learned long ago, when the world doesn't give you much, you make the most of what little you have. The diner was a second home, not because it was warm or welcoming, it wasn't, but because it was the one place she could earn enough to keep the lights on and her father alive. 6 days a week, 10-hour shifts, tips she couldn't count on, and a boss who watched her like a hawk. Vic, the manager, was the kind of man who believed rules were more important than people. He wore a pressed shirt with too much cologne and always carried a clipboard like he was running a 5-star hotel instead of a peeling corner diner with one working fryer and a leaking roof. Every time Grace slipped an extra scoop of fries to a tired mother or poured a coffee refill without charging, Vic noticed. He didn't always say something, but the look, that hard, calculating stare, always landed like a warning. You're not here to play charity worker, he told her once. You're here to flip tables and make sales. You want to save the world, Grace, do it on your own time. And she nodded politely, bit her tongue, walked away. But inside, something twisted. because she remembered what it was like to be on the other side, to be the one asking, is there anything cheaper? To be the girl pocketing half a sandwich to make it stretch for dinner. That girl still lived in her, and she refused to pretend otherwise. Grace didn't have much, but she had hands that worked, a heart that hadn't hardened, and a promise she made to her mother on her deathbed. Take care of your father, and don't lose who you are. So she kept showing up, kept serving smiles with her scrambled eggs, kept slipping extras to the regulars who looked a little too thin, a little too tired. Some noticed, most didn't. But the little boy from the rain, Eli, she didn't know why it stuck with her. Maybe it was the silence, the way he sat so still, like he was afraid even breathing too loudly might get him kicked out. Or maybe it was how he never asked for more, even when his stomach growled loud enough to hear. She didn't tell anyone about him, not Carlos, not the other servers, not even her father. He became her quiet secret, her daily reminder that kindness wasn't about being thanked, it was about doing the right thing when no one was watching. But secrets don't stay hidden forever. One afternoon, Vic saw her pass a to-go sandwich through the back door to a teenage boy waiting outside. He didn't yell, not right away. He just smiled, tapped his clipboard, and said, "Strike two, Grace." She stood frozen, sandwich wrapper in hand. He leaned in, voice low and condescending. "One more, and you're done here. I don't care how many sick relatives you've got at home." Grace said nothing. She just turned, walked back inside, and kept serving. That night, she cried in the walk-in freezer. Silent tears, no breakdown, just pressure leaking through the cracks. She pressed her forehead to the metal shelf, breathed deep, and waited for the ache in her chest to dull. Then she went home, heated soup for her father, held his hand until he fell asleep. The next morning, she was back at the diner. Same smile, same apron, same aching feet. But something had changed. The tension had deepened. Vic was watching. The clock was ticking. And Grace was running out of chances. The routine continued. Every few mornings, like clockwork, the boy returned, always slipping in just after the morning rush, always heading straight for the same booth in the corner. He never knocked, never said hello, but Grace always knew he'd been there. Sometimes she saw him walking past the windows before he came in. Other times he'd already be sitting when she turned around, quiet, unnoticed, as if he had just appeared from thin air. There was something about him that didn't want to be seen, something cautious, skittish, like a stray animal, unsure of the hand offering food. But she kept offering it anyway. Grace started preparing before he arrived. A bowl of oatmeal with cinnamon, a cup of cocoa not too hot, extra butter on the toast, little things he never asked for but always finished. He never wasted a bite. She watched him eat in silence, methodical and careful. Sometimes he saved half and tucked it into his hoodie pocket like he was hiding treasure. Once, when she slipped him an apple on his way out, he looked up at her and whispered something so soft she almost missed it. Just one word, barely audible, but it caught her off guard. She didn't respond right away. She just smiled and gave him a gentle nod like they'd reached an understanding. He never said anything else after that, not for days, but the next time he came in, he left another drawing. A tree this time, roots stretching all the way down the napkin, a small sun peeking out from the corner. Grace added it to the others in her apron, folding it like a letter from someone she cared about. But outside that small corner of the diner, the world wasn't as kind. More staff began to notice. Jenna stopped whispering and started rolling her eyes. Carlos made a joke about Grace and her pet project. One afternoon, Vic walked by the booth and let his gaze linger too long. Grace could feel his eyes as she wiped the counter, her body tense, pretending not to see. Later that night, he cornered her near the back office. "You think I don't notice?" he said. You think I don't see you giving out free meals like you're running a soup kitchen? He's just a kid, Grace replied. Vic snorted. He's not your responsibility. Maybe not, she said, voice steady. But someone should be. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You give that little beggar one more handout without ringing it up and you're gone. I don't care how many pity points you think you've earned around here, got it? Grace didn't flinch, but she didn't argue either. She nodded, walked past him, and clocked out early that night. She didn't sleep. The next morning, she stood in front of the register, hands trembling slightly as she typed in every item the boy ordered. Coffee, toast, 1 egg. It rang up to $5.63. She paid it herself, slipped the receipt into her pocket, and served him without saying a word. He noticed. She saw it in his eyes. The way he looked at her hands, the receipt still peeking out of her apron. He didn't say anything, but he left half his toast untouched. She wrapped it for him anyway. The boy never stayed long, 15, maybe 20 minutes. Then he'd vanish into the gray city streets, swallowed by the cold or the crowd. But every time he left, Grace felt like something in her went with him. She didn't know why he mattered so much. Maybe it was the way he sat, always on edge. Maybe it was the bruises. Maybe it was because he reminded her of her own son. The one she lost. That part she never talked about. Not even to her father. But there had been a boy once, not much older than this one, whose laugh still echoed in her dreams, and whose face she sometimes swore she saw in passing strangers. She had buried that grief deep, locked it away. And now somehow this silent child in a soaked hoodie was picking the lock. She started bringing extra food with her in the mornings. Not for the diner, for him. Granola bars in her coat pocket, juice boxes, crackers. Whatever she could afford after rent and medicine. Some mornings, he didn't come. Those were the hardest. She'd catch herself looking at the booth, listening for the doorbell, her heart sinking each minute he didn't appear. Once, she asked Carlos if he'd seen him. Carlos shrugged. Probably found someone else giving out free food. And she didn't reply. Just went back to scrubbing dishes with a little too much force. But then, 2 days later, the boy walked in again, hoodie soaked, face a little more hollow than before. She didn't say anything, she just placed a plate in front of him. He looked at her for a long time that day. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. He pushed it across the table. Grace opened it. Inside was a small, flat stone, polished and smooth with a hole worn through the center. It looked like something found in a riverbed. She looked up, confused. The boy finally spoke. It's for luck, he said. Then he stood, zipped up his jacket, and walked out. Grace held the stone tightly in her hand. She didn't know who this boy was, but she knew one thing for sure. He wasn't invisible. Not to her. And no matter what it cost her, he never would be. The whispering started small. At first, it was just glances. Co-workers exchanging looks when the boy slipped into his usual booth. A slight pause in conversation when Grace walked past. Nothing she could prove. Nothing she could call out. But she felt it, the shift in the air. Kindness, it seemed, was starting to make people uncomfortable. One morning, Jenna was topping off salt shakers at the counter when she muttered, "You sure he's not your kid? You treat him like he is." Grace kept her voice even. "No, he's just hungry." "Yeah, well, he's not the only one," Jenna snapped. "We all got mouths to feed, and Vic's not running a charity." Grace didn't argue, just moved past her and brought out a plate of pancakes for a customer who hadn't smiled in 3 days. But the comment stayed with her. It wasn't just Jenna. Carlos, the cook, had started dragging his feet whenever she put in an order for that kid. Once, he deliberately burned the toast and smirked when she scraped it herself and brought it out anyway. Even the regulars started to notice. One older man leaned in conspiratorially as Grace refilled his coffee. "Your little friend's back," he said, nodding toward the booth. "You adopting strays now?" She forced a chuckle and moved on. But inside, something twisted. She didn't understand how something so small, a meal, a moment, could make people so bitter. Maybe it reminded them of their own silence, their own inaction. Maybe they didn't like seeing compassion that cost something. Vic, of course, had been watching everything. He confronted her right away. No, Vic liked to wait, let things simmer, make you sweat. Then, one afternoon after the lunch rush, he called her into the back. The office was cramped and too bright, with peeling walls and a fan that rattled overhead. Grace stood across from him as he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "So?" he began slowly. "You and the kid?" Grace didn't move. "What about him?" "You feeding him again?" "I log everything I serve," she replied. "You can check." "Oh, I did," he said, sliding a stack of receipts across the desk. "You're very thorough, which is why I'm curious why a kid with no money, no parent, and no clue keeps getting hot meals in my restaurant." Grace didn't blink. "Because he's hungry." Vic leaned forward. His smile was tight, almost amused. "You ever think maybe this isn't your problem to fix?" She met his gaze. "You ever think maybe it is?" He didn't like that. The smile dropped. "You've got one warning left, Grace," he said flatly. "One. You want to throw your job away over some stray kid? That's your choice. But don't expect me to clean up the mess when he drags something dangerous through that door." Grace's jaw tightened. "He's just a boy." "No," Vic said, his voice low. "He's a liability." He waved her off like she was dirt on his sleeve. Grace walked out without another word, but her hands were shaking. That night, she went home and pulled out her small jar from the shelf, the one where she kept the boys' drawings, the napkin notes, the river stone. She looked at each one like they were pages in a book no one else had read. These weren't gifts. They were proof that the world still had soft places, that someone had noticed. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, the jar in her lap, thinking about everything she was risking and everything she already had. Her father stirred in the next room, coughing again. She was barely holding it together. Rent was late, the medicine was running low, and now Vic was circling like a hawk, waiting for her to slip. But somehow, when that boy came in, for those 20 quiet minutes when he sat in the corner and ate without fear, it made everything feel a little more bearable, a little more right. The next morning, she opened the diner as usual, prepped the booths, brewed the coffee, set the sugar packets on the corner table the way he liked them. 2 pink, 1 yellow, perfectly aligned. And when he walked through the door, soaked and silent as ever, she met him with a smile. Like always. But this time, something was different. He hesitated at the threshold, eyes flicking toward the kitchen. I don't want to get you in trouble," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Grace's heart cracked. "You let me worry about that," she said gently. He stepped inside, and for now, that was enough. The moment he left the diner, the warmth disappeared. The cocoa, the pancakes, the quiet reassurance of Grace's voice, all of it faded behind him as the door swung shut. Outside, the wind cut through his soaked hoodie like it wasn't even there. Eli pulled the hood tighter around his face and started walking. He always took the side streets, less chance of being noticed, less chance of being asked questions he couldn't answer. "Where are your parents? Why aren't you in school? Are you in trouble?" He didn't have good answers. He moved quickly, head down, sneakers splashing through puddles, every step soaked deeper into his socks. He didn't wince. He was used to the cold, used to the ache in his joints, the tight knot in his stomach. Hunger didn't scare him anymore. Neither did being alone. What scared him was getting caught. 5 blocks from the diner, he slipped into a narrow alley between 2 apartment buildings. The metal fire escape rattled as he climbed, hands numb against the cold steel. On the third floor, he swung onto a small ledge and tapped twice against a boarded-up window. Nothing. He tapped again, then a third time, softer. Inside, a shadow moved. The boards shifted, a frail hand pushed the curtain aside. A woman, maybe 60, pale and thin, opened the window just enough to let him slide in. "Lee," she whispered. "You're soaked." He shrugged. "Brain again. You need a better coat." "I'll find one." She didn't argue. She just sighed and helped him step down into the dark room. It smelled like dust and old medicine. A single space heater buzzed weakly in the corner, barely touching the cold. The woman, his grandmother, sank back into a chair, her body heavy with exhaustion. "Did you meet?" Eli nodded and handed her the bag Grace had packed. Half a sandwich and some soup. She smiled, faint but grateful. She the same woman as before? "Yeah, she's kind." Oh, he didn't say anything, but his eyes softened. They had been living in the abandoned apartment for weeks. It wasn't really theirs. The locks had broken months ago. No one seemed to care. As long as they kept quiet, kept the lights off, no one came asking. Lee gathered water in a bucket from the busted pipe in the bathroom. The faucet hissed and gurgled, but it worked. Mostly. He poured her a cup, then sat near the heater, arms wrapped around his knees. His grandmother coughed, dry rattling. "We'll figure it out," he murmured, more to himself than her. "I'll get something soon, maybe a job." "You're 11, she reminded him softly. "I'm 12. He laughed, a brittle, painful sound, and reached out to touch his arm. "You shouldn't have to carry all this." He shrugged. "Somebody has to." There was no school anymore, no caseworker, no father. His mother had been gone long enough that even her name sounded strange when he thought it. The last foster home hadn't lasted. He hadn't meant to run, but when they started locking the fridge and shouting every night, he figured he was better off on his own. He'd always known how to disappear, but the diner was different. Grace was different. She never looked at him like a problem. She never asked why he was alone. She just served him like he mattered, like he belonged there. It scared him at first. Then it started to feel like safety. Like maybe for those 20 minutes, he was just a kid. And that was dangerous. Because getting used to kindness meant he could lose it. He couldn't let that happen. He looked at the stone on the windowsill, the same one he'd given Grace a few days ago. He used to keep it in his pocket for luck. Found it near the river months ago. Smooth and cool, with a hole through the middle, like a coin made by nature. Giving it to her, it had felt like something important, a trade, a way of saying thank you without saying the words. He hoped she still had it. He hoped she knew what it meant. That night, after his grandmother fell asleep, Eli stayed up, knees hugged to his chest, staring out the crack in the boards that covered the window. He could still see the diner sign in his head. The warm glow, the smell of bacon, the tiny clink of the spoon in her coffee cup. It was the only place that didn't make him feel like a ghost. And no matter how cold it got, he planned to go back. As long as Grace let him. As long as she kept seeing him. He would keep walking through the rain. The day started like any other. Grace unlocked the diner at 5:30. IMM flicked on the lights, brewed the coffee. The radio played soft static. Rain tapped against the windows. Everything felt routine. Until she saw Vic standing by the register. Clipboard in hand, tie too tight, smile too rehearsed. She felt it immediately. Something was off. "Morning," she said carefully. "Need you to double-check inventory today," he replied without looking at her. "And keep an eye on waste. We've been bleeding small costs." She nodded, "Sure." But inside, her stomach twisted. Vic never spoke in full sentences unless he was setting a trap. Still, she went about the morning like normal, brewed extra coffee, set up the booze, waited for the moment she looked forward to the most. And right on time, he came in. Eli, wet hoodie, quiet steps, eyes scanning the room before he slipped into his booth. He looked tired, paler than usual. She wondered if he'd eaten anything since yesterday. She brought him his usual without saying a word. Pancakes, orange slices, a cup of cocoa, and this time, a folded sandwich wrapped tight in foil. "For later," she whispered. He nodded once, almost smiled. But across the room, Vic was watching. He didn't say anything at first, he just stared, eyes hard, fingers twitching like he couldn't wait to pounce. Grace tried to ignore him. She poured coffee, took orders, wiped down tables, but she kept glancing toward the booth, toward Eli and Vic, and the moment they would inevitably collide. It happened faster than she expected. She was refilling Eli's cocoa when Vic finally snapped. He marched over, voice loud, hands gesturing for the entire diner to see. "Well, well, isn't this cozy?" Grace froze. Eli's eyes widened. Vic leaned in, voice sharp as glass. "This how you spend my inventory budget? Hot chocolate for hobos?" Grace straightened. "He's a customer. He's a freeloader. He's a child." Vic turned to the room. "Anyone else want free breakfast? Apparently all you have to do is sit here and look hungry." The diner went still. Forks paused midair. Conversations died. Grace's hands clenched around the coffee pot. Enough, Vic. But he wasn't finished. He snatched the foil-wrapped sandwich off the table and held it up like evidence. "This isn't logged. This isn't paid for. This is theft." Grace stepped forward. "I paid for it, out of pocket." Vic tossed it on the floor. "You think that makes you a saint?" "No," she said quietly. "It makes me human." A long silence fell. Vic stared at her, nostrils flaring. "You done here, Grace. Turn in your apron." Someone in the back gasped. Grace stood still, the pot of coffee still in her hand, Eli staring at her like the world was falling apart. She didn't argue, didn't beg. She untied her apron slowly, folded it once, then set it gently on the counter. Before she left, she turned to Eli, her voice soft but steady. "This isn't your fault. Do you hear me?" He didn't move. His mouth opened, but no words came. Vic smirked. "He won't be coming back anyway, not without you here to feed him." Grace didn't dignify that with a response. She simply walked out, head high, hands shaking. Outside, the rain had started again, cold, relentless. She didn't have an umbrella. Didn't need one. She just walked. Inside the diner, Eli sat frozen in the booth, heart pounding, fists clenched, eyes on the empty doorway where she'd disappeared. He'd seen a lot of people leave. This was different. This time, someone left because of him, and that was worse than anything. At first, Grace thought maybe she'd missed him, that he'd come in during a rush, slipped in and out unnoticed, maybe fed by someone else who didn't recognize what he meant to her. But she asked Carlos casually, then Jenna, then the new girl behind the register. No one had seen him. Jenna shrugged like it meant nothing. Kids like that, they move on, probably found another place that lets him loiter. Carlos didn't even bother lifting his eyes from the grill. Better he stays gone, place feels lighter. But to Grace, the diner felt hollow. The booth he always sat in stayed cleaner than the rest. Untouched, like even the mess had gone missing. One morning, she found herself slipping a sugar packet pyramid onto the table, out of habit. 2 pink, 1 yellow. Then, embarrassed by her own hope, she quickly brushed them into her pocket before anyone could see. Days became a blur. She found herself listening for the bell over the door, even when she wasn't near the diner, on the bus, in line at the pharmacy, walking past store windows. Every child with a hood made her heart skip. Every face just slightly too young sent a chill down her spine. What if something happened? What if he was sick? What if Vic had scared him so badly he didn't think he was welcome anywhere now? That thought haunted her most because she remembered the way he looked at her in that last moment before she handed over her apron and walked out. The way his eyes said, "I'm sorry," even though he had nothing to apologize for. And she hadn't been able to say what she needed to, that he mattered, that she chose to help him, that she would have done it all again. Every night, she kept food by the window just in case. A sandwich, a banana. Once, she left a small thermos of hot tea with a sticky note that read, "Stay warm. You are not alone." In the morning, the tea was gone, but she couldn't be sure if it was him. The streets had plenty of hands reaching for warmth. Still, it gave her. And then one day she found something at the edge of the alley near her building. It wasn't left on the bench or hidden under anything. It was just there, where someone had clearly meant for it to be found. A folded napkin. On it, a drawing of a booth by a window. A steaming plate. A little sugar pyramid. And under it, in careful handwriting, "Sorry I made you lose your job." Grace sat down right there on the cold cement, tears sliding down her cheeks before she even realized they were falling. She traced her finger over the drawing like it was a map, back to something she thought she'd lost. She didn't cry because she was sad, not exactly. She cried because she had her answer. It was alive. He remembered, and he still thought of her. She brought the napkin home and placed it in the jar with the others, sealing the lid tight like it was the most valuable thing she owned. That night, she cooked a full meal, not for herself, not even for her father, but for the chance he might come back. She packed it neatly, labeled it, left it on the bench near the diner just as the streetlights blinked on. Then she waited across the street for an hour, then two. Traffic slowed, lights dimmed. The last customer stumbled out of the diner and lit a cigarette. Still no sign. Grace stood up to leave, hurt heavy eyes dull, when she saw movement in the shadows near the alley. A small figure approached. Cautious, quiet. Eli? He checked the bench, saw the bag, reached for it, then froze, sensing her across the street. Their eyes met. She didn't wave, didn't call out. She just smiled. A soft, silent smile that told him everything she couldn't say aloud. He held the bag to his chest, gave a tiny nod, and disappeared into the dark. That was enough. It was still here, and that meant something. It was a slow morning, the kind Grace used to love. Quiet, manageable, almost peaceful. But now they felt empty, like something was missing, like someone. The new girl at the counter scrolled on her phone between customers. Carlos grunted from behind the grill. Jenna argued with a supplier over the phone in the back office. Same old, same old. Grace wasn't working, not officially. She had stopped by to drop off a tin of cookies she'd made for Carlos's birthday. A peace offering of sorts. They weren't talking, but she knew he had a soft spot for oatmeal raisin. She lingered by the window just for a minute, just long enough to pretend everything felt normal. That's when the door opened. The bell rang, but this time it wasn't Eli. A man stepped inside. Tall, clean-cut, mid-40s, dressed in a sharp black coat with polished shoes and a silver watch that probably cost more than her rent. He looked out of place, like he'd taken a wrong turn on the way to a boardroom. Grace noticed him right away. Everyone did. He didn't look at the menu, didn't take a seat. He just stood there, scanning the room, like he was searching for something. Jenna popped out from the office, suddenly chipper. "Good morning. Table for one?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward and said in a clear, precise voice, "I'd like to speak to the owner." Carlos peeked through the window into the dining area. Jenna blinked. Vic's not in right now. Can I help you? The man's expression didn't change. Do you have security footage from last month? Jenna stiffened. Why? The man pulled a badge from his coat pocket. Not a police badge. Something higher. Federal. Secret Service? Grace's heart stopped. He flipped the leather open just long enough for her to see the seal, then tucked it away just as quickly. This is a matter of federal interest. We're not here to disrupt anything, just gathering information. Jenna was already nodding, flustered. Of course, of course. If you come back later, I can have the owner... Before she could finish, 2 more people stepped in behind him. A woman with a briefcase, another man with an earpiece. Grace backed toward the door instinctively, unsure what this was, but certain it wasn't random. The lead agent looked around again, slower this time. His eyes landed on the booth by the window. Eli's booth. He walked toward it, ran his hand across the table, then sat down, just like Eli used to. Grace couldn't move. She was across the room, invisible to the others, but she felt it, like a punch to the chest, like a signal had been fired and someone somewhere was answering it. The man turned to his team. This is the place, he said quietly. Get the timestamp. The woman opened her briefcase, pulled out a tablet. They began reviewing footage, angles, printing photographs, the booth, the meals, the layout. Grace felt like she was watching a crime scene investigation, but nothing had happened. Nothing but kindness. She couldn't make sense of it. What did the Secret Service want with a rundown diner? Why were they inspecting that booth? His booth? Like it held the key to something? She stepped outside. The wind hit her like a slap. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to catch her breath, trying to slow her racing thoughts. Then a black SUV pulled up to the curb. Another man stepped out. This one older, white hair, strong build, commanding presence. He didn't speak, just looked through the window, at the booth, at the agents. Then his eyes found Grace, just for a second, and something in his face changed. Recognition? No, reverence. Before she could process it, he turned and walked inside. The door closed behind him, and for the first time since Eli disappeared, Grace felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Something was coming, something big, and she had no idea what. Grace didn't cry. She didn't scream or argue or ask for a second chance. She'd learned long ago that life didn't always reward what was fair. Sometimes it punished the quiet ones hardest. But that night she stayed up late, sitting in the kitchen with a pen and a grocery receipt, listing every bill that was coming due. Rent, electricity, her father's medication, bus fare. There wasn't enough. She tried to stretch the numbers, break them apart, rearrange them in some magical sequence where everything worked. But no matter how she calculated, it ended in red ink and quiet desperation. She folded the paper slowly and placed it beneath the jar of napkins, like maybe being near those tiny drawings would remind her why she did it. Why she kept choosing people over policy, even when it cost her everything. Her father peeked into the kitchen again. He'd been restless, coughing more than usual. You sure you're okay, sweetheart? I'm fine. You lose the job? She hesitated, then nodded. Because of the boy? She nodded again. He hobbled over, slow and shaking, but sat down beside her. You did the right thing. That's not always safe, but it's always worth it. She wanted to believe him, but belief didn't pay rent. Belief didn't keep the lights on. And belief wasn't going to put food on the table next week. Still, she nodded. Thanks, Dad. He smiled. You're your mother's girl, through and through. Back at the diner, Vic was spiraling. The federal agents had returned, briefly, asking more questions. scanning the place again, reviewing timestamps, checking cameras. He hadn't told the staff the truth, hadn't told them that the agents weren't investigating a crime. They were looking for someone, or more accurately, looking into someone. Vic didn't know who, but he knew it had something to do with the boy, the one Grace used to feed, the one he called a liability. He rewatched the footage on his office computer, the grainy image of Grace setting down a plate, refilling a cocoa cup, slipping a wrapped sandwich into a small hand. Every time he watched it, something tightened in his chest. Not guilt, fear. What if he'd made the wrong enemy? What if this was bigger than he thought? One of the agents had mentioned something strange on their way out, said the boy might be someone to watch, someone important. Vic didn't understand it, didn't want to, so he doubled down, cut hours, fired 2 more staffers for budget reasons, replaced Grace with a college intern who barely knew how to carry a tray. The regulars noticed. Some of them stopped coming. Others came, looked around, and left without ordering. The place lost something, a hum, a warmth, a rhythm that Grace had somehow kept alive, even in the hardest moments. Vic pretended it didn't matter, pretended things were running fine, but deep down, he knew something was off. And it all came back to that booth by the window, empty now, like it was waiting. Grace started walking past the diner at different times of day, not going in, just passing, watching from across the street as the world inside her old life kept turning without her. She saw Vic pacing, saw Jenna serving with her fake smile, saw customers glance around in confusion as if trying to remember what was missing. And every time she walked by, her eyes drifted to that booth. Still empty, still sacred, still his. She didn't expect to get the job back, didn't want it anymore, not with Vic in charge. But part of her couldn't let go of the place where it all began. The place where she first saw that boy soaked in rain and wrapped in silence. The place where a simple act, a meal, a towel, a smile, had become the only real anchor he had. She wondered if he was walking past too, somewhere in the city, alone, wondering if she was still out there. She thought about leaving another note, but what would she say? I'm still here. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. It happened just after sunrise. Grace had been up all night again, sleep nowhere to be found. Bills sat in a neat, ignored pile on the kitchen table. The lights stayed off to save power. The only sound was her father's breathing, shallow but steady, from the bedroom. She was pouring the last of the oatmeal into 2 chipped bowls when someone knocked on the door. Not a friendly knock, not a neighbor knock. 3 sharp raps, deliberate, measured. She froze. For a second, her heart stuttered. No one ever came by unannounced. Her landlord usually just posted notices. Her friends, what few she had left, always called. She waited, breath caught, the spoon still in her hand. Another knock. Her father stirred in the other room. Gracie? Someone at the door? I'll get it, she called softly. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and approached the door slowly. Looked through the peephole and stopped cold. A black SUV idled at the curb. Standing in front of her door was a sharply dressed woman in a long navy coat holding a clipboard. Beside her stood a man in a dark suit with an earpiece, scanning the hallway like a seeker was about to walk out of it. Grace opened the door just a crack, cautious. Can I help you? The woman smiled, kind but purposeful. Grace Carter? Yes. The woman handed her a sealed envelope with no return address, thick paper, embossed lettering, heavy in her hands. You're requested to be at Ellie's Diner tomorrow morning, the woman said. 8 o'clock, sharp. Grace blinked. Excuse me? The man beside her gave a subtle nod, then added quietly, "This is not a request you'll want to ignore." Before Grace could respond, they turned and walked down the hall, disappearing into the SUV without another word. She stood there for a moment, frozen in her doorway, envelope in hand. The chill from the hallway crept down her spine. The silence in their wake was deafening. She closed the door and leaned back against it, heart pounding like a drum. Her father called out again, "Everything all right?" She looked down at the envelope. Thick paper, a single line etched across the front in bold lettering. "Confidential for Grace Carter." "I don't know," she said softly. Then she opened it. Inside was a letter. Brief, printed, no signature. "You are cordially invited to attend a private breakfast meeting at Ellie's Diner. Please arrive at 8:00 a.m. Security clearance will be provided upon arrival. Do not share this invitation. Dress appropriately." That was it. No sender, no title, no explanation. Just a date, a time, and a quiet weight hanging off every word. That night, she barely slept. She laid out the best clothes she had, a clean blouse, black slacks, a coat with one missing button she sewed back on at midnight. She tried not to imagine what this was, tried not to build hope she couldn't afford. But part of her, the part that had kept Eli's notes in a jar all this time, couldn't help it. Someone knew who she was. Someone had noticed, and tomorrow, they wanted her back at the place that had taken everything from her. The diner. The same diner where she lost her job. The same booth where a boy used to sit. The same room where a sandwich cost her everything. She stood in front of the mirror that night and stared at herself for a long time. Tired eyes, worn hands, shoulders curved from years of lifting too much for too long. She didn't look like someone important, but maybe that was the point. Maybe someone had finally realized the truth she'd known all along, that sometimes the smallest kindness is the loudest kind of power. The murmurs from the crowd quieted. Eli gripped the sides of the podium, his hands steady. Cameras zoomed in, reporters leaned forward. Somewhere behind him, sirens passed faintly in the distance, but the world seemed to still. Grace stood a few feet back on the edge of the platform, the early light casting a soft glow on her face. She didn't know where to look. At him, at the ground, at the hundreds of eyes staring up at her like she just stepped out of some forgotten history book. Then she heard his voice, clear, calm, certain. "I want to tell you a story." No speechwriter's polish, no policy pitch, just those 6 words, heavy with memory. He paused, the kind of pause that makes people lean in without realizing they are. "Years ago, I was just a boy, homeless, hungry, alone. Most days, I didn't know if I'd eat. I didn't know if I'd wake up safe or where I'd sleep that night. I was invisible." Grace's breath caught in her chest. "She didn't know my name," he said, looking at her now. "She didn't know my story, but every morning before the sun came up, I would sit in the same booth. I never asked for food. I didn't need to. She brought it anyway. Every time," he turned back to the crowd, "she gave me hot soup, cocoa with extra sugar, towels when I was soaked through. She packed extra sandwiches and napkins when she thought no one was looking. She told me, 'You matter. Don't forget that.'" A hush fell over the street. She didn't do it for attention. She didn't do it for credit. In fact, she lost her job because of it. Whispers rippled through the reporters. She paid a price for her kindness, quietly, without complaint, and I disappeared, thinking I'd never see her again. He paused, voice lowering. But I carried that kindness with me, through foster homes, through cold nights, through every chapter of my life. It shaped the man I became. It gave me the strength to believe I was worth more than the world told me I was. His voice cracked slightly, just enough for the silence to lean in closer. So, yes, I am the President of the United States, but before I ever stood behind a podium, I sat in a corner booth, and the woman who served me there, who showed me what dignity and love look like without ever asking for anything in return, is standing here with me today. He turned to her again, eyes bright with unshed tears. Her name is Grace Carter. Applause began like a soft wave, then rose, fast and full, filling the street. She didn't wear a cape, she didn't make headlines, but she changed the course of my life. She reminded me that people matter, that we rise by lifting others, and in a world too often numb to suffering, she saw a boy no one else did. He looked directly at the cameras now. There are people like Grace everywhere. Quiet heroes, tired, overworked, underpaid, but carrying the world on their backs with simple, everyday acts of courage. We must start seeing them, celebrating them, investing in them. He turned back to her one last time. Grace, you saved my life. Not with money, not with power, but with kindness. And today I want to say what I should have said all those years ago. He stepped away from the microphone and faced her fully. Thank you. The crowd rose. Camera shutters snapped like thunder, but Grace didn't hear any of it. All she heard was the trembling voice of a boy from long ago, finally free to speak. And she knew, without a doubt, he had never been invisible, and neither had she. The crowd had started to disperse, but the buzz lingered in the air like static, as if something sacred had happened and no one quite knew how to come down from it. Inside the diner, Grace sat at the booth like she had hundreds of times before, but never like this. Never with the world watching, never with a plaque etched with her name glowing from the wood. Across from her, Eli, the boy she once called her nephew to keep him safe, now held meetings with world leaders and ran a nation. He stirred his cocoa absent-mindedly. "You used to do that," he said with a small smile. "Just like that. 2 slow turns, tapped the spoon once on the side of the mug." She laughed quietly. Old habits. He sipped, then set the cup down. "I came back once, you know, a couple of years after you were gone. The new waitress said you'd been fired, that you'd left without a word." Grace nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. There wasn't much left to say. He looked at her. "I looked for you. I asked around, checked shelters, school records, but I didn't know your last name. I didn't even know if Grace was real." She smiled gently. "It's real. Though, for a while, I didn't feel like I was." Silence settled for a moment between them, then she added, "I thought about you too. I used to walk by the booth, just to check, just to see. I thought you might stop believing in people." She met his eyes. "I almost did, but something told me I hadn't seen the last of you." Ellie leaned back, folding his hands. "There were days I almost gave up. The kind of nights where everything hurt and no one cared. But I'd think of you, of that note. You matter. And I tell myself, if one person believed that once, maybe it could still be true." Grace swallowed the knot in her throat. "You carried that much weight," she said, "and still made it here." "I carried you with me," he corrected, "every step of the way." A knock on the glass pulled their attention. One of Eli's aides entered, apologetic, urgent. He handed the president a phone with a waiting call. Eli looked to her. 2 minutes? She nodded. As he stepped aside, Grace stood from the booth and walked toward the counter. She ran her fingers along the edge where the laminate had always peeled, the same place she used to lean during long night shifts, the same corner where she'd stood when Vic had fired her in front of the whole room. She looked around. The booth was still the same shape, the floor still creaked in the same spot near the bathrooms. But everything had changed. Or maybe everything had simply caught up to the truth. She turned to the plaque again. "Grace Carter, the woman who saw me." She whispered the words aloud as if they were too heavy to say at full volume. Then something caught her eye. A small envelope propped gently beside the napkin dispenser. She hadn't noticed it before. She opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. Familiar, sharp letters. You were the first person who fed me without making me feel like a burden. You saw more in me than survival. You saw potential. Because of you, I survived long enough to dream. And then I chased it. She folded the note slowly, pressing it to her chest. Billy returned a moment later, slipping his phone back into his coat pocket. Sorry, crisis in Brussels. Grace gave a tired smile. You've got a few more responsibilities now. Somehow they feel lighter today. He checked his watch. I need to head out. Motorcade's waiting. Grace followed him to the door. Reporters were still loitering beyond the barricades, but the intensity had dimmed. The cameras had turned elsewhere. As he reached for the handle, he turned back to her. You know, I've stood in rooms with kings and prime ministers, been applauded in places I never thought I'd be welcome, but nothing has ever meant more to me than sitting in that booth across from you again. Her voice was quiet. You don't owe me anything. I know, he said. That's why I came back. Then, before he stepped out, he said one last thing. I'll be in touch, Advisor Carter. And with that, he disappeared into the morning light. Grace stood in the doorway, the wind brushing her cheeks. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't forgotten. She was the beginning of something that had touched the world. And as she looked down at the stone in her palm, still warm from her pocket, she understood. Sometimes the smallest acts ripple the farthest, and sometimes a simple meal, given in silence, changes the course of history. Vic sat in the back booth, hunched over a cold cup of coffee, the blinds drawn just enough to block the sun, but not the whispers. He'd stopped checking his phone hours ago. There wasn't anything left to see that didn't make his stomach turn. A video of Grace wiping down Eli's table with her gentle smile had been looped with emotional music by a major content creator. 32 million views in less than 12 hours. The comments underneath all said the same thing. We need more people like her. How did they ever fire her? Shame on that manager. They weren't subtle. Someone had found an old Yelp review mentioning Vic by name about how he once refused to let a man charge his phone to call a shelter. That got circulated too. Suddenly Vic's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. He tried to play it off at first. Bad PR cycle, he told a friend on the phone. It'll blow over. But it didn't. A local news anchor ran a 5-minute segment titled How One Act of Cruelty Tried to Erase a Hero, featuring slow pans of the diner, old staff interviews, and a line that made Vic's stomach churn. He didn't just fire her, he silenced the kindness that saved a future president. By lunchtime, protesters showed up outside the diner. Not in mobs, just 2 or 3 at first. Quiet, polite, holding handwritten signs. We see you, Grace. A meal saved a nation. Boycott cruelty. Vic pulled the blinds tighter. Inside, customers dwindled to a trickle. No laughter, no clatter of plates, no smell of fresh coffee, just silence. Even Carlos, the cook, moved slower now, like every step he took in that kitchen carried the weight of disappointment. At 3 p.m., the phone rang. Vic expected it to be another reporter. It was the owner. Vic, we're letting you go. He didn't argue. He knew better than to ask why. Grace is back on our radar, the owner added. She won't be coming back here, obviously, but corporate wants to offer her a public apology, maybe rename the booth Clean House. Vic said nothing. Bad optics, the owner muttered. You understand. Vic hung up and stared at the booth across the room. Eli's booth, now glowing with sunlight through the slats in the blinds. He suddenly remembered the day he fired Grace. The first half of both ways, Grace fired Grace, the way she'd folded her apron, the way she didn't fight. Not with fear, but disappointment. He had thought he'd won that day, but now he realized he hadn't just fired a waitress. He'd tried to erase a moment of goodness, and the world had remembered it anyway. Miles away, Grace stood in the middle of a quiet community center, newly refurbished, freshly painted. On the front glass doors, a new logo had just been stenciled in gold. The Carter Foundation, Feeding Futures. Eli had called her that morning. "I promised I'd help you help others," he said. And he meant it. The foundation would fund meal programs for at-risk youth across the country, hire local staff, train diner workers to recognize silent hunger, offer legal aid to homeless teens. And Grace, once fired for handing out pancakes, would be its director. She didn't celebrate loudly. She didn't cry in front of the cameras. She just opened the doors at 9 o'clock IMing sharp, laid out the fruit and cereal on long folding tables, and waited. The first kid who walked in reminded her of Eli. Too thin, hoodie zipped all the way up, eyes scanning for exits. She didn't say much, just handed him a plate and pointed to the warmest spot by the window. The boy hesitated, then sat. And for a moment, a brief, brilliant moment, Grace stood perfectly still, sunlight catching her hair, as if the whole world had turned back, just to say, "You were right to care. You were right to stay kind. And we see you now." The diner booth sat empty again, but not like before. Not like the days when Eli disappeared and silence was sharp. Now, the silence around that booth felt reverent, almost sacred, like a church pew kept for someone who changed everything. It was never reserved, yet no one dared sit there. People would come just to see it, snap photos, trace their fingers along the brass plaque beneath the window, whisper stories they'd only heard online, like pilgrims visiting a holy site. The woman who saw me. Some said it gave them hope. Some said it reminded them to look twice at the people they passed on the street. Others left notes under the sugar jar, anonymous, folded corners, scribbled in marker or crayon or careful cursive. Grace kept every single one. She didn't frame them. She didn't publish them. She placed them gently in the same glass jar she once kept in her kitchen. It now sat behind the counter, beside the register where anyone could see it. Inside were the same memories that started everything. The heart-shaped paperclip, the napkin with the dinosaur drawing, the smooth river stone, and now dozens more. A thank you from a girl who ran away, a note from a teacher who fed her student in secret, a wrinkled dollar bill taped to a torn corner of notebook paper that read, "For someone hungrier than me." Grace had never asked for any of it, but the world gave it back anyway. That's what happens when you give freely, not to be seen, not for reward, but simply because it's right. She still visited the diner once or twice a week, not for glory, not to be recognized. She came to sit in a corner booth, watch the people, and remind herself of the quiet rhythm of things. The sound of clinking mugs, the low hum of morning conversation, the hiss of pancakes on the griddle. It grounded her. The world outside had become fast and loud. The foundation had grown. The press never quite let go of her name. Sometimes she was in meetings, sometimes she was on a plane, sometimes she was being called advisor or director or, more recently, ma'am. But here, she was Grace, just Grace. One morning, she came in earlier than usual. The city hadn't fully woken up yet. The sidewalk outside was still washed in the silver blue of dawn. Rain had passed through in the night, leaving small puddles and the sweet scent of wet pavement. She took her seat not in Eli's booth, but the one beside it, her booth now, the one she always chose. Carlos had long since retired, but the new cook, a young woman named Mina, brought her coffee without asking, 2 sugars, splash of cream. As she stirred, the bell over the door chimed. She looked up instinctively. A boy stood there, alone, hood pulled over his head, sneakers too big, a plastic bag clutched in one hand, leaking rainwater from the corner. He scanned the room with wide eyes. Didn't move. Didn't speak. Grace stood slowly. She didn't rush. She didn't smile too quickly or make a big gesture. She just walked over, gentle and quiet, like approaching a deer in the woods. "You all right, sweetheart?" The boy didn't answer, but he didn't run. She nodded toward the booth beside Eli's, the same one where dozens of others had now sat. "Come sit, warm up." He hesitated, then moved, almost cautiously, like he wasn't sure he was allowed. She let him settle in, didn't ask questions, didn't make a scene. She just brought him a plate. Eggs, toast, a glass of orange juice. She added a cookie to the side. "For later," she said, just like she used to. He didn't say thank you, but his shoulders lowered, his jaw unclenched. He ate like it had been a while. When he was done, she passed him a napkin. "You want to take anything with you?" she asked. The boy looked at her, then down, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny object. A marble, faded blue with one tiny chip in it. He slid it across the table. Grace blinked, took it in her hand. She didn't ask why. It didn't need to. She smiled, stood, and walked to the jar behind the counter and placed it inside. Outside, the rain started again, soft, just like it had all those years ago. She turned to the window and saw the reflection of the booth. The boy, the plate, the light. And in her heart, she felt it, not fame, not legacy, not pride, but peace, because the story was beginning again, right where it always had, with one small act of kindness and someone choosing to see. Months passed, seasons shifted, the city changed as cities do. New buildings rose, old ones crumbled. People came and went, stories intersected and unraveled. But the booth stayed. So did the plaque, and Grace, in her own way, stayed too. Not always at the diner. Her days were fuller now. The Carter Foundation had expanded into 3 states. She traveled, spoke at schools and shelters, met children who reminded her of Eli. Quiet, bruised, wide-eyed, and told them what no one else ever had. "You matter." She never mentioned the president unless she was asked, and even then, she downplayed it. Because the real story, in her eyes, had never been about who he became. It had always been about who he was. A boy no one saw. Until someone did. One chilly October morning, Grace returned to the diner before opening hours. She had called ahead, asked Jenna, now the manager, if she could borrow the space for something private. She let herself in, greeted the early prep cook, and made her way to the booth. Eli's booth. She sat down alone, steam rising from a fresh mug of coffee, hands wrapped around the warmth. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a box. Inside, a new plaque, smaller than the first, polished, simple, but full of meaning. She gently unwrapped it and placed it beside the original. For the ones who come next. Underneath, take what you need, leave what you can. Kindness lives here. As the light poured in through the window, she sat back in the booth, soaking in the quiet. Outside, a school bus rumbled by. A cyclist passed with coffee in one hand. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. The world was still spinning, but in this small corner of it, something had rooted. Something lasting. A waitress. A boy, a meal, a moment, a seed planted so quietly it could have gone unnoticed. But it didn't. It grew. Grace stood, tucked the box away, and placed a single sugar packet, 2 pink, 1 yellow, on the table, just like always. Then she walked out the door, pulling her coat tighter against the breeze. She didn't turn to look back. She didn't need to. because Grace Carter had never been about grand exits or loud applause. She was about the quiet work of changing lives, one plate at a time. And in that booth by the window, with the sunlight slanting just right, her story would never end.